Welcome to the first spring session of City Forum on behalf of the graduate program in community regional planning. I'm happy to welcome you to our kickoff session today. And we're really pleased to have Professor Michael Holleran speak today. He is not only a preservationist, he is a bridge builder. Did you know that? He builds bridges between disciplines, and he also is not only a thinker, but an outside-the-box thinker. So he's on the innovative edge of a lot of things, and we're going to hear about that today. And it's from his forthcoming article that will be telling you about another example of thinking outside the box. So let's welcome Michael Holleran.
Note to self, new subtitle, Climbing Outside the Box. This year is the 50th anniversary of the demolition of Pennsylvania Station in New York City. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of the New York City Landmarks Ordinance, who are not coincidentally related. Year after that will be the 50th anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act. So preservation is about to be historic itself, eligible for designation. In that 50 years, preservation in the United States has grown tremendously, has come to have many, many more roles, be more interested in many more resources. The one thing that has not happened very much is evolution of the basic paradigm by which preservation operates. That paradigm is the landmark. So let me review it. Landmarks are unique. They're one of a kind. They are permanent. Loss of a landmark is not acceptable. You can see this baked in even to international law in the law of war as amended and adopted after the Second World War. The Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property, to the extent that armies pay attention to it, says things with this blue shield on them, you don't touch them, all of other stuff. So that boiled down even into military law is the idea of the landmark as permanent, irreplaceable, not to be harmed. And finally, cost is not a legitimate object. Cost is not an intrinsic object of figuring out what to do with landmarks. It is, of course, a reality of the world. It's a consideration that we may need to acknowledge. It's a consideration that other people who are not in the landmarks guild will pay attention to. But as far as thinking about landmarks, cost is outside of the calculus. So to review, landmarks are unique, they're permanent, and they're outside the calculus of cost. If you think about this picture, it sounds a lot like the way we think about individual medical care when we are the patient. Each patient is unique. Loss of the patient, not acceptable. And cost is something that we very much hope our insurance company keeps us from having to know anything at all about. Obviously, if it's the treatment we need, cost is no object. Okay. As preservation has evolved, as it has come to look at many more kinds of resources, there have been critiques from both within the tent and outside the tent of how we approach these parts of the environment that we value. The paradigm of uniqueness has been stretched and stretched, particularly as we look at more recent resources, as we look at post-war suburbia, as we look at industrially produced mass pieces of the environment that nonetheless are historically, culturally of interest to us, uniqueness gets stretched to the point that we find ourselves designating things, recognizing things as the most representative of this large type. The best surviving example on this block. When I was chair of a landmarks board, we once had presented to us a staff recommendation that a building should be designated because nothing significant had ever happened there. That was unique. They'd never seen one of those before. Permanence gets challenged as we look at resources that were never built to be permanent. Resources, roadside resources are a category often put up for a short lifetime, often achieving iconicity in a way that makes us appreciate them much longer than their creators would have expected. And then we have a problem with that tangible built environment. More fundamentally, permanence is challenged as a piece of the paradigm as we look at more complex kinds of resources, as we look at cultural landscapes which depend upon continuing traditional use, as we look at cultural complexes, as we look at the intangible culture of places, as we look at food and music and festival and social dimensions of places. These are not things like the stones of a cathedral that you can go and take physical care of and leave them alone and expect them to still be there. So permanence is stretched. We get critiques from outside the tent, particularly on these questions of cost, both economic and opportunity costs. I don't know if you can read this, Rem Koolhaas from his exhibit, Chronochaos, 4 years ago at the Biennale, 3 years ago at the Museum in New York City. You'll see this back here. No new buildings can be constructed in the historical zone, now comprising over 12% of the habitable space on Earth. It came as a surprise to many of us to learn what all-powerful people we preservationists were. And I am still looking for the 12% of the surface of the Earth that we control so dramatically that nothing is happening there. Apparently, much of Antarctica is historically stripped, I'm not sure. But we get more coherent versions of this. Edward Glaser, in his Triumph of the City, has a chapter on the perils of preservation, and with a good deal more evidence of footnotes and having done some research, he tells us that 15% of Manhattan's non-park land south of 96th Street is now in a historic district where every external change must be approved by the Landmarks Commission. So probably a little more accurate, I haven't checked it, but I believe it, as far as the area he's describing, and less hyperventilating about the way that he's describing what landmark controls mean. But nonetheless, the criticism is that this is too much, that this comes with an opportunity cost of things that we should be doing instead of spending so much time controlling so much of the environment. And in each of these cases, the gist of the complaint boils down to, here's a thing that makes sense For some kinds of places, yes, there are landmarks, there are monuments, but you have pushed this way, way too far. That's the core of the position of each of them. And Koolhaas makes himself into a cartoon character because that's what he wants to do. Laser is easy enough to criticize for the density fetish that he substitutes his one dimension for what he's describing as the one dimension of thinking of preservationists. But preservation does have a simple enough paradigm that it makes itself easy to be a target for someone who's asking why every single doorknob in 15% of Manhattan needs to go through the process that may very well be entirely appropriate for Grand Central Station. If we look to that analogy with medical care, can we learn something? Can we find a step outside the box to think about a different way to look at it? Why, yes, we can. Talk about public health as opposed to individual medical care. Paradigm of public health, in place of looking at the individual patient, looks at populations, defines whole populations rather than the single individual who has presented as a patient. Rather than looking at mortality as the unacceptable, off the table, not going to go there, looks at mortality as a fact, treats it as an indicator, sees where do we lose members of this population, how do we lose them, what can we do about that. Other kinds of indicators may also be defined and managed. And finally, cost, economics, is a core concern. The goal of public health is, with the resources that we have, of course we will argue for more, but with what we have, how can we save the most lives? How can we do the most good for the most number of people? Most importantly, public health is not in conflict with individual care. Public health does not supplant individual care. The two of them are completely complementary, mutually supporting. If I have the best health care in the world, if I have President Obama's personal doctor waiting in Air Force One for me, I still am healthier and more likely to have good outcomes if the population around me does not have communicable diseases, if the water that I'm drinking does not have pathogens in it. So public health and individual medical care, no conflict at all, but two entirely different paradigms that work in parallel. So if we try to take that other paradigm from the health world and think about it in terms of buildings, what does that look like? What does that suggest to us as possibilities? Well, if we scan around at what preservationists are actually doing, we discover there actually are a lot of things that we're doing that look a lot like that public health paradigm. We haven't had a language for describing it. One very prominent, great success of the last generation of preservation in the US, the National Main Street Center, set up by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in the late 1970s. You think about this, if you're familiar with it, it helps, I don't know, 90 or so, somebody in the room can give me the number, main streets in Texas, hundreds, thousands around the country in different programs. It uses tools that are economic restructuring, that are retail promotion, basically community organizing, lots of things that do not fit into I'm going in front of the Landmarks Commission and asking if I may change out my doorknob. It came from essentially an epidemiological approach to we are losing lots and lots of historic buildings in lots and lots of small towns around the country, and we have figured out, this is in the 1970s, the National Trust, we figured out that throw all the resources you want at any one building, and it's not necessarily going to work if the community around it, if the little downtown around it is sinking, is not healthy. So it was a clear-eyed epidemiological assessment of what are the causes of mortality of this population of buildings, and what can we do about them? Those things that we could do about them turned out, very few of them, to be in the regular toolkit of preservation. They've worked. Among another set of preservation toolkits are federal investment tax credits for historic preservation. The ones that we are most familiar with, the ones that we count, the ones that we pay attention to, are the rehabilitation, the historic rehabilitation tax credits, which give you a 20% tax credit and bring you through an entirely recognizable normal design review, historic research, landmarks paradigm. There's another one, which is the 10% tax credit, and you are reading the entirety of the rules there. You have to leave up some walls and leave up some structure, and you check the box and you get 10%. It's available to all buildings built before 1936, a population, nobody examining the individual patient. And it's a sort of invisible act upon a population by a simple indicator means, no special landmark treatment involved. The National Trust in the past few years has set up the Preservation Green Lab in Seattle, which is a sort of sustainability think tank for the national preservation community. One of their projects that one of our classes participated in last year before, field research for looking at buildings, commercial buildings of less than 50,000 square feet around the country. Doesn't matter if they're historic, doesn't matter. The whole population. Examine the whole population and look for systemic solutions for their energy efficiency and better performance. Practically everything the Preservation Green Lab does falls into some version of this kind of approach of identifying a whole population, forget the details about whether the building had George Washington in it or was designed by someone we knew, and just look at what are these shared problems and are there solutions for them. I will also give a shout out to Place Economics, Donovan Riptema's firm in Washington, which is doing a project called Relocal, which is taking a similar kind of approach to shrinking cities and demolition and abandonment in shrinking cities as a generic population issue to be addressed by over 80 different indicators and tools, one narrow slice of a handful of it having anything to do with conventional preservation. And finally, practically every involvement of preservationists with disaster planning, hazard planning, and mitigation follows very closely a public health kind of approach. Seismic retrofit of unreinforced masonry structures, a big issue for life safety in seismic active zones, a big issue for the mortality of buildings as well as people, and a problem which, if you can solve it, you will save some landmarky kind of buildings, and you'll save some other kinds of buildings. That's one of the things in common of all of these public health kinds of approach to preservation is, if I can borrow and make a happier version of a military term, the collateral benefits that you may accidentally, while you are doing things that you wish to do to save buildings you like, you may save some other buildings too. Okay. So if we take the public health approach with its different definitions of how to go about achieving its goals and try to make that systematic as a paradigm in preservation, what would that look like? How would we do that? First, we need to define populations. In Austin, there are approximately 4,945 buildings listed on the National Register. You can see the plus or minus in any of these numbers. And if anybody in the room wants to take any of these numbers and use them for anything, please talk to me first about methodology because they are a mess. But let's call it 5,000 buildings on the National Register. There are approximately 14,000 buildings that have been the subject of some historical survey. Some, the first entry ramp into the landmarks paradigm. Is the building significant? Is it of interest to the landmarks paradigm? That is not what that's supposed to look like. I don't like that. Well, the number's right, so if you can color those in yourself. Approximately 46,000 buildings in Austin are more than 50 years old. So we begin to have a population of all the buildings that under federal preservation rules we are theoretically interested in. 74,000 buildings greater than 40 years old. The 40-year threshold I can point to as best practices for carrying out an historical survey, because that way when you finished it, your survey will have at least a 10-year shelf life. 74,000 buildings that are theoretically of interest to us in that way. 111,000 that are greater than 30 years old. 30 years happens to be the threshold for designation under the New York City Landmarks Ordinance, but I would point to that one as being of interest for a more epidemiological public health kind of reason, which is that 30 years is the amortization period for a residential mortgage. It is usually at the long end of an amortization period for commercial real estate financing. It is a threshold at which people would describe this as the lifetime of the building, as if, okay, let's go carry out until it's 30 years old. But what it really means is that in financial terms, in those practical terms that we preservationists don't pay any attention to, this is where we begin to enter the decision point for the future of buildings. Before 30 years, we're mostly paying for them and using them as we intended. Sometime after that, 30, 40, 50, 60, sometime after that, it's time to decide whether we are reinvesting in them or doing something else. 221,000 buildings altogether. There's our total population. So somewhere in here, in the city of Austin, somewhere in here is a population of things that we might be interested in. And if we are taking a population-based approach, it's probably more than this little precinct colored in up here at the top. We have to define indicators. Building mortality is a fairly simple one, and like human mortality in public health, one of its advantages is that it's pretty universally, it's much easier to find out whether a building is gone or not than it is to find out whether it's eligible for the National Register or not. There are other kinds of indicators, particularly in other parts of the country that are shrinking rather than growing. We might look at abandonment rather than mortality, rather than the building going away. But a key to these indicators is that they're simple. They're things that people are already looking at, counting, thinking about for reasons other than landmarks. Let me give an example of an indicator that may be familiar to some of you. The National Trust in 1980 came out of a number of studies during the 1970s, during the first energy crisis, quantified and promoted the idea of the embodied energy in old buildings. All of this energy went into creating the materials, all this energy went into erecting the building. You knock it down, all that energy goes into a dumpster. You don't want to waste energy. Another part of an indicator-based approach is that you're doing this in order to take your indicators seriously. So a test that I would recommend to the preservationists in the room in your heads is, how seriously do we take embodied energy? If we did take it very seriously, then facade preservation, in which 98% of the mass of a building goes into dumpsters and goes away, is probably not something that we would celebrate as quite such a big success. At the other end of the scale, 1% of the mass of a building going into the dumpster, when that 1% is the curtain wall of an iconic modernist tower, probably wouldn't have us squealing quite as loud as it usually does. And I'm not recommending trashing modernist towers. I know that I need to say this, lest I be quoted. I'm just asking, do we pay attention to this indicator that we spend a bunch of time creating? Another part of taking a public health approach has to do with the idea of permanence and the possibility that, as with public health, as with a public health approach, acting upon populations to help people live longer, healthier lives, that simply extending the life of buildings without focusing on, have we saved it permanently, is it permanent, might be of interest to you. I put up Battle Hall and West Mall building because the way that this came out most practically to me, Fran and I have been involved for several years with different phases of the campus master plan for UT. And over the past couple of years, the campus planners had consultants who were doing an historical survey of the whole campus. And the campus planners, not us, not the preservation, the campus planners referred to the outcome of this historical survey as identifying the forever buildings. That was how they looked at it, is that the things that are going to get the gold star, top rate historical significance are the things that they understand they're going to save forever. They're going to hand them down 100 years from now, and their successors will hand them down after that. And everyone's example always was Battle Hall, so it's a good thing. West Mall building is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And one of the first things that gets said about West Mall building, or any other building that people are arguing about in this survey, is, but it's not Battle Hall. It's not. It's not Battle Hall. What the campus planners were happy to do as we talked through what are these different kinds of resources and how do we look at them, they were happy to divide in operational sense the forever buildings. We are committed to saving these from these other buildings that we can recognize as having cultural or historical or architectural significance. We can recognize them as assets, but the way we're going to recognize them is by saying, in our 30-year plan, we're not erasing them. We're also not trying to bind our successors 30 years from now. We're going to hand them down to the next decision process. And one of the things that really was instructive to me about this is that preservationists do try to think in the long term. And I think campus planners are one of the other professional groups who really have a time horizon. They took seriously that we're happy to say this thing for 50 years, but we take 50 years from now seriously enough to say, at that point, our successors may want their options open, and we are not going to bind them. They took seriously keeping the options open, and they took seriously the commitment that they were making. So I would recommend, or I just would say that this is part of a public health approach to take these different time frames seriously enough to say we can make a decision now, we can affect the outcome of a building now in a way that will pass it on to the next decision point. And we know, leaving aside preservation, we know that somebody in 50 years is going to do what they want to do no matter what we've said. We can acknowledge that intellectually through a paradigm that says these things are commitments, they're sacred. These things are decisions, and we've made ours and handed it on down. I think this letting go of permanence actually helps us achieve more preservation. First of all, because we don't get the Rem Koolhaases and Ed Glazers laughing us out of court to say, no, you can't save everything all the time forever. But also, here is New Orleans after Katrina. Talk about climbing out of the box. Here is New Orleans wanting to climb out of the bathtub. Here is someone's projection of Florida 100 years ago. And I've had many people, including preservation-oriented people, say, New Orleans is toast. We're going to lose New Orleans, therefore, why fill in the rest of the sentence, but we're going to lose New Orleans, it's not forever. We can't possibly save Miami forever, so why should we try? I would suggest that I would be very happy for my as yet hypothetical grandchildren to have a chance to experience New Orleans. And we can sort these things out later. If we acknowledge that very little of the world is permanent in a way that we can control, then we can get on with saving things for the times where we can't have impact. So, finally, if this different paradigm became a parallel with the landmarks paradigm, if the landmarks paradigm had a little sister and the two of them could work together, what would this look like? Well, what does this mean? First of all, this is a radical, this is outside of the preservation box. If people who are preservationists are sitting here nodding and everything sounds okay, then you haven't been listening, because starting with populations of buildings without asking their cultural significance is not what preservationists do. That is the starting point of preservation as we practice it. I think it's a little less radical in effect once you've worked it through for a couple of reasons. One is, I think, if you actually took an objectively population-based approach to looking at existing buildings, you would discover that their cultural reception, what we think of them, whether we like them, turns out to be one of the best indicators of whether they are like, what their mortality rate is likely to be. The other reason even more fundamental, gets back to the purpose of public health. If you solve problems for buildings irrespective of their cultural significance, you will have solved problems for buildings that are culturally significant. In fact, I think much of the exceptionalism of the landmarks approach, much of the trying to exempt landmark buildings from various rules in order to, at all costs, save each one, much of it, not all of it, some of it, would not be necessary if you could just get the rules of the game all round to favor those existing buildings. Again, that was the insight of the Main Street program. It's the insight of many of the programs that I showed. Solve the problems for all the buildings, and the ones you really care about have their problems solved. Second thing, I think taking this approach would move the sometimes uneasy, distant intersection between preservation and sustainability to a preservation union with sustainability. We are, in many ways that many of the preservationists in the room can tell you, trying to solve the same problems. It doesn't always help when we have a language that seems to be obsessed with what is the Mullion profile in this particular window, while the people on the other side of the table are trying to save the world. I think that if we are looking at whole populations of buildings, how they perform, how they work, we find that we have, not only that we have something to offer, which we do, but that we're more likely to be speaking a language in which it will be recognized. And finally, I think that there is an empty space, because there is unclaimed territory falling between the cracks of some of our professions. Preservationists look at existing buildings, and long ago I should have said, I don't mean this all to be about buildings. It's harder to form all the sentences if I say cultural landscapes and this and that and the other thing. But preservationists look at the existing built environment if it is culturally significant. If it's not, outside our scope. Architects look at buildings when it's time to do something with them. They look at places where buildings don't exist and invent ones that take existing buildings and figure out the magic word, the word that is being uttered in every other room in this building is intervention. No intervention, nothing to talk about. Planners are very much the same, a somewhat broader view of different things that count as interventions, but these are action-oriented professions. And simply trying to understand the steady state of what's out there, continuing to exist and how it works, tends to be not that interesting. There are professions that do this. The simplest one is property managers. Property managers for a particular portfolio, whether it is the UT campus, whether it is a commercial real estate firm, look at how existing properties work and pay attention to it before it's time for the intervention. But that has an agency problem that property managers only manage property if there is some owner big enough to operate at that scale. What all the little owners of all the little properties is the reason that the Preservation Green Lab looked at small commercial buildings, because property management and their consultants had the big ones taken care of. Nobody was operating at the scale of the millions of disorganized people who are owning the property, operating it, but not in any meaningful sense managing it. There are, within that space of looking at the whole existing environment, there are a special sector. There are people who pay attention to housing. There are people who pay attention to energy retrofitting and energy performance. the general field of what is the existing environment and how's that stuff work is basically out there up for grabs. Do we want it? I don't know. I look forward to the conversation. So, in a conventional presentation, this would be the time when I sum it all up and leave you with an inspiring marching message about public health and our new way of thinking. And I hope I have suggested some useful things to you. But I actually want to end this differently. It's time for questions, but you all have heard there's no such thing as a free lunch, so I'm going to flip the tables here, and I have some questions for you. Two questions. First one, is this the right metaphor for the paradigm? Thinking about public health, the metaphor has been very powerful for me in being able to think through these things about what preservation is not doing and what other ways there might be to approach things. I don't know that it's necessarily the right or the most effective. I'll give you one very specific example. The main cause of building mortality is demolition, including large-scale demolition as a matter of public policy in places that have excess buildings. That conversation doesn't work well in a public health metaphor unless you go back to the Nazis, and it's not my purpose to suggest that demolitions in Detroit are a new Holocaust. I may not agree with them, I may not like them, but I'm not saying that it's morally out of bounds to even think about demolishing buildings. So there's a metaphor problem there. Interested in any thoughts? And the other one is, what do you call this? Even if public health is the right phrase, I can't call it public health because public health means public health. I can't call it public health paradigm for preservation because that's a mouthful, it's not going to happen. I don't think so new urbanism got a nice two words, one like new urbanism or not, at least you know those two words, you know what it is. What's the tag? The one place, the place where these conversations are really going on is primarily in Europe, where the main term is building stock management. And I don't know, that's probably translated from the German, and maybe it sounds sexier in German, but it's not doing it for me. I've tried out a number of phrases. I have had students who have been generous enough to tell me that epidemiological preservation is the dumbest thing they ever heard. Please don't say it again. So those are my questions. Thank you.